Welcome to the Confident Brushstrokes podcast with your host, Stephanie Paige Thompson. Stephanie is a young but internationally celebrated representational artist. On this podcast, Stephanie will interview other living master artists as well as answer questions from representational artists around the globe. We'll share practical insights to help you create with more clarity, conviction, and joy. Let's get into it. Welcome to episode 3 of the Confident Brushstrokes podcast. I'm a co-host. My name is Adam Eek, and we are joined by
Stephanie Paige Thompson. Welcome, guys.
Stephanie, it's so good to see you again. I feel like I don't see you that often.
That's a major lie. We spend 24 hours a day, 7 days a week together, but it's good to see you here too, hon.
On a personal note, I work remotely. I work from home, so Stephanie and I truly spend every waking moment together. We love it, but it gives us the opportunity to do projects like this. It's so much fun, and we truly are best friends.
Yep, and I'm excited about this third episode of the Confident Brushstrokes podcast, which is fueled by questions from the Broadcasting Brushers community, my Patreon, where we're doing live painting together. So Adam has gotten some questions for us. We've talked a little bit about the topic. So you can tell us a little bit more, Adam, about what we're going to be talking about in this third episode.
Yeah, we'll have plenty of time to get into that, but a couple quick housekeeping items. We're excited to announce we've got a couple master artists already lined up for Stephanie to interview. We're waiting to grow the audience a little bit more, but that's really coming in the imminent future. So we're very, very pleased about that, and we think the audience will be too. Before we dive into the deep end of the pool, what are you working on in the studio?
I actually just finished up 2 large pieces. Not necessarily large, 18 by 24 and 16 by 20. The 18 by 24 I've been working on for pretty much all of January. So about 3 straight weeks. I just finished that. It was a multi-day painting. Obviously, if I was working on it for 3 straight weeks, a figure in a landscape. So that one I just finished yesterday. And then I actually also just finished a portrait, which was begun during a Broadcasting Brushers episode. And I'm so excited about this piece because the start was strong, right? It looked like him, but we had some tech issues that night. And always when I'm talking a lot while painting, I paint a little bit slower. I'm getting faster with every single episode, every session with the Broadcasting Brushers, but the start had some promising parts to it, but it wasn't necessarily something that I thought, oh my goodness, I see an incredible finish here. But I really wanted an incredible finish because the sitter was so interesting, so uniquely handsome. And so I was working on that this week. And when I painted the dominant eye, which was the right eye, his left eye, I learned some new things. I was really pleased. I stepped back at some point and I saw what was happening on the canvas, and it actually made me so excited. And then shortly after, I had this realization that this eye was one of the better eyes I've ever painted. You came down into the studio actually, and I was like, look at this eye. Do you see that this is a special eye, or is it just me? And you corroborated. So I'm sort of now going to be able to open up into some new subject matter.
One of the Broadcasting Brushers who was watching along during our last live stream was watching you paint, and she said it really feels like there was a specific stroke that you made that made this nose 3-dimensional and jump off the canvas. I feel like we experienced that in real time when you nailed that eye. And this is a really great example, and it will dovetail very well into the content that we're discussing today. And it's really about intentionality, paint application, painting alla prima versus working in layers. The painting that you worked on, this portrait, you painted weeks ago and had your base layer, but you literally had to pause, and you came back 3 weeks later and spent another 10 to 12 hours on it as well. So I think when you're answering these questions, that you're likely going to be drawing on a lot of that experience painting this recent portrait.
A lot of recent experience as well as past.
Before we get in, there's one thing that I think that's very fun to note is that we've seen a lot of paintings being created from Broadcasting Brushers models that are being entered into shows, that are placing, that are winning shows. Talk to the audience a little bit about that, about how the reference models are becoming this resource for artists to gain access to models and then even being able to submit these paintings for shows.
So there's painters in the community from all around the world. And since I make a point to follow every single artist that's in the community when they join, I am noticing when I open my Instagram that I will be flooded with very familiar faces because I know all of the models, right? So when I open Instagram, I'm seeing all these different faces, and some of them are local, some of them are in New Zealand, some of them are in Spain, across the ocean, right? You can use the photos that we upload, you can work from the live stream and use those reference materials and sell them and enter them into shows, because it's not a coached session. It's not a workshop setting where I, as the teacher, am coming around and painting on the painting. I might advise, oh yeah, maybe pay attention to these values. That's no different than if we were all together just as casual friends painting a model together, which that's really what Broadcasting Brushers is anyway. Sure. It's not a teaching setting. There's no other brushstrokes made on the paintings from another artist, which would then disqualify it from being entered into a show. So it's very exciting to me to see artists. A lot of artists have goals in the community of starting to enter the marketplace with their work, which, you know, you've noticed if you listen to episode 2, all these questions about selling work. Those are all being spurred from the community. So it's exciting to see these artists really challenging themselves, and some carrying on their careers, some starting a career entering the marketplace and being able to use Broadcasting Brushers reference materials to jumpstart that.
If I remember correctly, we've got one artist who won Best of Show, another artist placed second, and Stephanie has also won an award and sold a painting from Broadcasting Brushers episode 7, that portrait of Mark Burkett.
Yes, incredible. It's in the Richmond Art Museum's permanent collection, which is my second museum acquisition, which is very exciting.
Yeah, these reference photo packages truly are a game changer, and what we're seeing, what we're hearing from the community is there's nothing else out like this to where artists gain access to these live streams, all this reference material. And the beauty of it is this podcast was really birthed from all of these artists asking questions and really thinking through their practice and their process as they're painting. So exciting. So let's go ahead and dive into what we're going to be discussing today. And the topic that we're going to be going through is painting with intentionality and also paint application, layering versus alla prima, and we're really going to get into the weeds here. So are you ready?
I'm ready.
Cool. Stephanie, first question. Stephanie, I would love it if you could share some insights on the process of making a painting involving multiple sessions.
This is a very good and a very broad question. So in the case of this recent portrait that we talked about, I painted it for 3 hours from life, and then it dried completely over 3 weeks before I came back and had the time to finish it. And then I worked on it for a subsequent 4 days. So it was drying all along the way as I was then finishing it. It was by the end of it, you know, the things I had done on day 1, by day 4, that stuff was also mostly dry. So when I'm approaching a piece that I'm going to work on in multiple layers, what I really focus on is trying to think a couple of steps ahead of myself. So what that would look like would be the initial tone of the canvas will be in the value that the majority of the painting will be in. If this is a landscape and it's roughly, there's deep areas of shadow in the woods and then areas of very high value in the sky, but the primary portion of the painting is resting in a middle sort of 4 or 5 value, I'll tone the canvas in that value in a color that will complement, or in a color that will be actually the complement of the main color, depending on whether I want a visual vibration of color or a harmonious color. And keeping that same value will allow me to have parts of the canvas show through and get this texture. So there, I don't have to completely cover the whole canvas, sort of like Rembrandt will do. You'll look at his portraits and see portions that look like there's sort of this greenish paint applied to the face, but it's just the raw canvas showing through, and it makes a really interesting visual vibration of thick paint and thin paint, and then just the wash of the canvas. So that's one way that I'll think a couple of steps ahead of myself. What will I want this tone of the canvas to be? What will I want the value to be to help me later, so that I don't then have patches of white showing through that I have to cover the entire canvas and get an effect that I don't necessarily want later down the road. Maybe that is my goal, and in that case I would work a little differently, but I think through what the end painting is going to look like by spending time with myself in my brain, whether I'm at the easel or not. My best thinking work about paintings is done when I'm not at the easel. And I actually, this is kind of funny, but I actually solve problems in paintings in my dreams. I have done it 3 or 4 times and woken up and realized I was dreaming about the painting and I knew what I needed to do on it. It's not every single time, but it has happened, like I said, 3 or 4 times. Looking at that vision that I have, I will plan the piece and try to think a couple steps ahead of myself.
Yeah, let's go a couple layers deeper here as well, because I'm thinking in my head as an artist, how much preparation and execution goes into this process that you can plan for versus what's unplanned. And in this context, do you have natural stopping points for your sessions where you'd say, let's take a portrait, for example. I've done my initial block in, and now I've got my big shapes, and now I need to think about nailing the eyes and the nose, and I'm going to finish for today and pick up next session. How are you approaching that? Is there some set system or process that you have, or is it much more by feel? And then I've got a follow-up question after that too.
I have very natural stopping points in my painting sessions in my current life stage because of motherhood and just adult responsibilities versus me 8 years ago. I have all day long to paint, it would look a little bit different. It's actually much more beneficial for me now having these very clear boundaries around my painting time because I don't do as much overpainting as I did in the past when I had more time on my hands, more time to overthink. So I have a natural boundary for my painting times just built in because of my current life stage. If I know that I am going to have only X amount of time to paint, I will not start, say, the heart of the painting. If it's a portrait, the eyes are very, very important, depending on the pose, depending on the lighting and everything. But by and large, mostly the eyes are very, very important. I'm not going to start painting the eyes in the last 30 minutes of my painting session. And then if I know I won't be able to get back to it for 2 or 3 days, have all of those edges of the paint dry and maybe create some texture that then I have to work with in the next session that I have a couple of days later. I will wait to go into that very delicate part of the painting, whatever it might be. The eyes is just an example, until I have the time to really work on it and get it to a point where I'm happy with the edges. I've figured out the placement entirely. It might not be done, but I have it blocked in. I have it ready to go for the next layer. I've thought through the thickness of the paint so that it isn't going to have really thick parts in places I don't want thick paint eventually, so that it's really difficult for me to work on top and add more layers of paint. And instead of adding richness to the piece like we see in Fetchin and Rembrandt, where they're obviously working in many layers and it just enhances the piece, instead it will create this very overworked, way too thick of paint approach, which can happen very easily by not thinking a couple steps ahead. So if I have a limited amount of time, what I will always try to do, especially if I'm going to be working in multiple sessions on a piece, is I will make a loose block in. So I have an idea of where I'm going and the placement, but I won't get into the details of a certain area until I have real time to really develop it and think about the edges and the paint application.
That's extremely beneficial for the audience to hear. For my edification, and perhaps this will help the audience too, do you have a set system for the features or aspects of portraits that you always tackle in the same order? Does it work like that?
That's a really good question. I don't really. I actually have a tendency of leaving the features, the most important features, for last. And I've really tried to flip that around because it's extremely stressful. So in the past, I would block the face in, kind of like I talked about just a moment ago. I would block it in, get the placement, get the big values, get the big shapes, but not get the tiny nuances, the very completed edges and subtle nuances of color. Get the block in, get get it to look like the person, and then move to the other parts of the painting to bring them up to a certain level of finish as well, and then return to that focal point, which often is the face in a painting that has a person in it. The face factor is what that's called. We'll always look at the face if it's in a painting, whether it's highly rendered or not. I, in the past, would leave that for the very end, and it became very stressful because then I would have mostly finished the other areas of the painting, and thinking the other areas would be more difficult, I had saved the portrait for last. But then, as portraits always are, they are very difficult regardless of how many you've painted, because you're always learning more things and learning how much you still don't know with every new nugget that you understand a little bit better. So now I've flipped that a little bit, and I do still try to bring all parts of the painting up together so that I don't take any area too detailed or leave any area too loose. Try to manage everything all at once. All the edges and all of the shapes really matter all together. But I do try to not leave the eyes for the last because it's just stressful.
This next question runs very parallel to what we're discussing in terms of focusing on painting over multiple sessions. And when we think about broadcasting brushers for the audience, Stephanie is painting the model from life. A lot of the artists listening will also have the opportunity to paint models from life as well. And when we think about multiple sessions, for you, what's high priority to capture with the naked eye when you're looking at a model face to face versus when you come back to finish from the reference photo?
Okay, this is such a good question. I'm really glad that you asked this. Very, very important to capture from life, and especially if you're going to be working on that same piece for a long period of time, is the likeness and the proportions in the colors that you're seeing that your camera may not be able to capture, depending on the quality of the camera that you're working with or your ability to interpret what the camera has captured, okay? If you are gonna work multiple sessions on a piece and you don't pay attention to the placement of the block in, even if you're not going to get much past the block in, your subsequent sessions are mostly going to be spent moving things around. And that really will have the strong potential to nuke the freshness of the strokes. The strokes might be beautiful, the color might be beautiful, but they're in the wrong place. And if you're going to make a finished piece, they need to be in the right place. So that first session after you come back is just moving everything around, really hurting that alla prima feel. You can have a painting that's been worked on multiple sessions that feels alla prima. Great example is every painting Sargent ever painted. Some of them were alla prima, a lot of his portraits were not, but they feel like they were. I can guarantee he was nailing the placement first so that every subsequent session, as he applied more paint, it was in the right place. So everything he added was just benefiting the piece rather than constantly chasing around trying to find where it would go. And then the color and the value, of course, is very important. Don't necessarily have to have the widest range of edges or even the color nuances, but finding that color relationship that is present from life, very, very important. And then also sort of the rhythm of the piece. This is something that I've been thinking a lot about recently, and I want to incorporate more into my future portraits, particularly my alla prima portraits, is this feel, especially if you want a vignette, but even if you don't want to finish it as a vignette, there's a feel of having the model in front of you where, this recent model, which was from Session 22, Mario, he had a very powerful, commanding presence. And I captured that in the tilt of his head, even though I didn't follow my own advice and didn't get the placement exactly right. I did have to spend some time moving things in my subsequent session, but I didn't capture that feel past the portrait. And I wish I would have used that energy from life and responded to it and gotten even just a vignette of his shoulders and neck in, because you can capture it from a photo later, but there's something about being there from life, these decisive strokes that you make, that later in the studio, especially if you really like how the portrait is turning out, you start second guessing, because depending on the material or the canvas that you're working on, the paint will either wipe off very easily and you can try again, or it won't. And in this case, I was working on a linen and it was toned, and so wiping it away would really start to mess up the piece. So I felt a little bit more cagey and not as free to make these loose strokes. So that's something I'm going to focus on, is really capturing that rhythm of not just the portrait, but how it connects to the shoulders.
An adjacent thought that I have as well in regards to capturing the rhythm of a model, and this is a little bit different from artist to artist. I think what's incredible about what you do is how you're able to communicate with a model and also to capture their rhythm by conversing with them and getting them to open up. So when we think about this model that Stephanie's discussing, Mario, not only did he have a very commanding presence, but a very authoritative way of communicating with us and others, and you can feel that gravitas when you're in the room with him. And that's something that I think you do exceptionally well, and that I'm sure a lot of the artists on Broadcasting Brushers would also agree with me, is when you're interviewing and when you're conversing with the model, it's a great way to get into that rhythm and understand who they are, and that comes through in your painting as well.
I think it's a very powerful part of portrait painting, and I've always leaned more towards even life drawing groups where the model is encouraged to talk. These sterile groups where no one is talking, I just find I have a lot of time painting in silence in my studio. I don't need that necessarily when I have the opportunity to have someone painting from life. The photo is going to be quiet and everything's going to be in the right place, and not moving if I need that at a certain current stage. But if the model is there willing to share their life and willing to show me the little nuances of every time they talk, they tilt their head just ever so slightly, and their family, when they see that portrait, if I capture that little tilt or that little dimple that shows up when they're talking to me and no other time, those little things are what make the likeness so much more powerful, because you can capture all of the features perfectly and in the right place and still have the model look like they have a ramrod instead of a backbone, because they were sitting there too long and they're zoned out. You can capture a very unenthused perfect likeness, or you can capture a very lifelike likeness that has those intangible things about the model that you can only capture with them conversing or, tipping their hand, showing their personality by conversing.
The encouragement here is we totally understand that the audience is at varying skill levels as well. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with being at this point in your artistic journey to say, I really am benefited most by when the model is a little bit more still. And what the encouragement here, the exhortation here is going to be, you should be looking to drive to the point of comfortability, being able to get a strong likeness and capture the rhythm of a model even when they're talking.
I'll counter with this, and it's not the same as portraiture, but for people that are sitting there saying, I'm not good enough to draw someone that's moving. Well, do you feel confident to go out on a windy day and do a scene with all of the leaves shivering and rustling and the water moving and the waves splashing? If you're painting anything in nature, it's constantly moving, and you actually get a better feel for it because it's moving than if it is sterile. It's so much easier to paint the ocean from life and get that movement and the rhythm of the ocean while it's moving than to come home from a photograph. How many plastic waves have we painted or have we seen painted, posted all over online, painted from a photo? So yes, it can be very difficult at the very beginning, but it also is the most excellent teacher, is painting nature in its natural form, painting it from life, even with those slight variations of movement.
And this is the joy for the representational artist. Outside of still life primarily, being able to paint landscapes, oceanscapes, people within a scene, and portraiture, you're painting living, breathing things that are animated and that have life. And that's a benefit to the artist.
For sure.
Let's get to our next question. Stephanie, how do you plan a painting so everything doesn't become thick and overpainted? I'm struggling with this.
So we touched on this a little bit in the answer to this first question that was shared. I will dive into it even more. Thinking a couple steps ahead of myself is probably the main way, but inevitably there are things that pop up in the painting process. You can have a very clear idea of what you want the painting to look like and do many studies, which is all part of my practice when I make a larger piece. So I try to eliminate the unknown variables when it comes to finishing a painting by having that clear image, doing multiple drawings so the proportions feel second nature to me. Multiple drawings so I feel the shapes are sort of ingrained inside of me. So when I get to the final piece, I'll know, this actually, the nose, I feel like it should be longer than this, but in my initial sketches, it was always shorter, and I need to go against my natural inclination and really pay attention to what's actually happening, not what I think is happening. And then color studies, I will do black and white studies and have all of this information to help me before I jump into the large piece. I don't always do this, but for a large piece that I know I will be spending a good deal of time on, I will do this. They don't take that long and they're really fun, and they actually work to make me more excited to jump into the large piece. So those are all ways that I think a couple steps ahead of myself to figure out the big problems in the piece, so that by the time I get to that final canvas and I'm working on the painting, no matter if it's a very large or very small, there's no area of the painting that I haven't resolved. An example of the opposite of this would be having a wonderful photo reference of a model in an amazing pose, but they're standing in front of a bank of garbage cans before the trash truck has come to pick it up. You don't want that in the painting. So, if you don't do this preparation and you just think, well, I'll just do a very loose and abstract, beautiful background, and you haven't done studies for how you're going to manage the color and those abstract shapes, because they will have a value to them. If I haven't thought through that, then I'll get to my final painting, and that's where I could have, I can't exactly rephrase how this person asked this question, but things be getting very thick and sort of unruly in the final painting. That will happen very easily if I haven't thought through the entire background, or even if it's just a small corner of the painting that you want changed from the reference photo, you haven't figured it out before you start. That is a prime time opportunity for you to really have the paint manipulate you rather than you manipulating the paint, and it to become very overworked and have a feel to it that you really don't want. So thinking those couple steps ahead and having a real plan for the painting are my ways to mitigate that feeling of being controlled by the paint versus me controlling the paint. I do have a follow-up to this, but it looks like you have a question you want to ask.
The piece that I'm drawing from it, I remember when we were recording Uncovering the Methods of the Old Masters, and C.W. Mundy, lo and behold, really focused on a study and preparation before diving into the final painting as well. What did he tell you about what he figured out when he went through this process of going through and creating a study? Like, what did he get out of the way, and what did he get in form of a benefit from going forward and using that study?
He figured out where everything would be and got a rough roadmap for the values and the colors that he would be using. And he verbalized to us in the process places where he would deviate from that study. And mostly what he deviated from was in the value, and he reduced the value, had more value compression than he had in the study. Overall made it a very much more masterful piece because the bright values were in the focal point versus there being a bright array of values around the entire painting. There was a more structured focal point, and then he actually also put less detail into pretty much every area of the painting. But because we were going to do that painting with only a palette knife, only 4 colors, painting on an almost 9 value dark canvas, it was almost black, the canvas. He was using that study to plan, like I just mentioned, how he would approach the piece, how it would look in the final painting, and use it as a way to say, this part of the painting really won't work when I get it onto a larger scale. It's impinging upon the focal point. I'm going to move it over just a tiny bit to the left, etc. What I will follow up really quickly is, you can do all of these planning pieces and do all of this work ahead of time. Invariably, in the process of making the larger painting, there will be an unforeseen problem, so to speak, that pops up, because by and large, our studies are very small. And in a study, you could paint a nose with 2 strokes, an entire hand with 1 stroke. In the larger piece, that same area will require tens to hundreds of strokes. And that process of sort of making something on a small scale versus a large scale is very different. It's an entirely different thing to keep the freshness when you're working with hundreds of strokes versus 1. If it takes 1 stroke to make the form, instant freshness, right? But then when you have it on a larger scale. So some of these things, these problems only arise even with all this preparation once you're making the final painting. And I have taken many paintings applied too much paint, not understand this difference between working on a study and then working on a finished piece and how the process is different. This is the only way that you can learn that process is by doing it, and then potentially having too much paint on the canvas in an area that you don't want it. I have sanded down paintings. I have used my scraper, and which I used to scrape off my palette, so razor blade, and used it to chisel off the texture, because not all texture looks like a fetchin and is stunning. Some texture can become too much. So there's all this preparation that you can do to help yourself, but the real reality of this is the way that you learn how to think a couple steps ahead and make a large scale painting without it being overworked or heavily applied or whatever it might be is by doing it wrong a lot of times, and learning and paying attention instead of throwing it away or scraping it off right away. Understanding, living with it, not defining yourself by it, letting it exist, even if you're frustrated with it, and figuring out why it happened in order to fix it in the next one. That's the only way to learn these things.
Something that's been incredibly helpful to you as an artist, I think, is asking yourself these sometimes difficult questions as well. First is being conscious and being aware of it. And then second is asking yourself these questions and wrestling with the painting itself. Am I overpainting? Are my values correct? All of these questions are swirling in your head. And this is something that you will wrestle, you'll grapple with it, but it is actually a superpower. This idea of being aware and this idea of questioning what you're doing and then being able to move on from that and being somewhat decisive. It dovetails very well into getting advice and feedback from other artists as well. But I'd say, look, half the battle is already won as an artist. If you're aware and you're conscious and you're asking, am I putting too much paint down here? Do I need to make adjustments? Who can I seek out in the form of someone who's going to give me advice to really help me over this hump?
Yes, just really quick before we move to the next question, something that I have found extremely useful is keeping a pack of index cards in the studio and a pen or a pencil, and at the end of your painting session, making notes of the things on the painting that you're liking, then making notes of things that the next session, the next day, the next 2 days, whatever your next session is going to be, what you're going to be working on. So I worked on a very large scale painting. One of my first large scale, well, it was my first large scale painting, was a 36 by 48. And at the end of every single day, I would make a note, love the hand, do not touch until you resolve the coat. The coat is too jumpy. Use a larger brush tomorrow and go into that coat, quiet all the edges down. And then a third would be reestablish the energy of the brushwork because it's becoming too jumpy and disjointed. Because so often we come back into the studio the next day and we just think, oh, I just gotta make this better, but we don't have a plan. So we just sort of jump in and start working everywhere. And then it starts looking overworked. The paint is doing things we didn't quite intend because we just don't have a plan. So having those bullet points, things that are going well, things that you're not going to touch and overwork and mess up, and then things that you want to see happen in the next day.
I love that the conversation has gone in this direction, because something that you and I have focused on is having me be that second set of eyes. And when you have truly nailed an aspect of the painting, say it's the subject's hands or the values on the shirt or a specific rendering in the background, what I focus on is making sure that I come to you and say, Stephanie, you have completed this portion of the painting. Whatever you do, please do not overpaint here and remove all of the fantastic work you've done here.
The famous saying is it takes two people to make a great painting, the artist and a loved one to take the brush out of their hand before they ruin it.
Yeah, let's get to our next question. So we've answered this first part of the question, but there's follow-up here that I think will be very valuable. Do you ever work in layers, or do you mostly do everything a la prima? You are working in layers more so than not, specifically because of the constraints that you have as a mother. There are often times where you're able to get to a painting and I think have continuity in terms of what you're focusing on, because you're painting and you've got a couple days before the paint truly dries. But I think this portrait from Broadcasting Brushstrokes 22 is a very great example of, no, that paint dried.
Yep.
And you're working multiple different sessions.
I can paint a la prima over multiple sessions, however, by not working on an area until I have the time to completely paint it. Alla prima, by and large, means wet into wet, painted all at one time without the painting or the paint drying. And I can do that even over multiple sessions. You can do that over multiple sessions by just roughly blocking in or just sketching it in and not painting that area until you have the opportunity to start, paint it, and finish it all in one session, wet into wet.
Do you let these layers dry completely first and then oil out every time before putting down a new layer?
I have not been big into oiling out in my career. There's a couple of reasons why. Because I have learned from master artists that if you don't overwork the paint will not sink in as much. Overworked paint will have the tendency to become dull. If you work the paint, you mix it as few times as possible, you lay a brush stroke down and leave it, that paint will probably stay pretty glossy even as it dries. It's the paint that gets worked and worked and worked and worked and then put on the canvas and licked and licked and licked and licked that is more likely to sink in and become dull and then need to be oiled out. That's not 100% true because for all cases, depending on the surface that you're working on, a really thirsty canvas will just take everything and it will become dull very quickly, but I am very rarely working on a thirsty canvas because I don't enjoy it. So if I do oil out an area because it is sunk in, because the colors are dull and the value is no longer reading properly, I'll do one of two things. If it's finished and that area looked great yesterday before it sank in, I will not touch it. And I will trust that it will look the same as it looked yesterday when I varnish it. So instead of trying to get it back and repainting it, I will just leave it as is if it was right yesterday and just trust it and then work with the values in the area that I'm working on and not overwork the piece in that way. Or if it has dried and I just need to bring back a little freshness, the only oiling out that I have real experience with is just taking a clean brush and a little solvent-free gel and just sort of taking it across the surface to bring that luster back.
All right, here's the next question for you. I'd be interested to hear about how you think on transparency and opacity. I know about the whole fat over lean, thin darks, and thin lights, but what are your thoughts on transparent pigments? Do you use them for glazing on, to scumble thinner paint over a white canvas for higher chroma? How do you plan a painting so everything doesn't end up thick and overpainted everywhere? This happens to me often. And how much direct painting are you doing versus layers where you set yourself up for the next stage? So it'll be helpful for the audience to make sure that we're not driving towards redundancy. So can you sift through that question and address new content?
Yes, we've already addressed the way to avoid having thick overpainted areas everywhere by thinking a couple steps ahead, even all the way down to the tone of the canvas, what the value and what the color is, so that it is driving towards success and complementing your final painting. So that part of the question we've already addressed, but the topic about transparency versus opacity, I am so passionate about. It's maybe one of the more nerdy topics in the artist world, and you can go very, very nerdy with it, talking all the way to the way that just physics works between transparent and opaque paints. I'll touch on it just briefly here. This is why the idea of thin darks and thick lights matters. And for people that aren't familiar with the topic or the term that this artist brought up in their question, fat over lean, it's this idea that by working from thinner paint to eventually thicker paint until that final highlight on the painting, which would be maybe your thickest paint, you will not only create a beautiful painting that will have the texture that you want instead of working thick to thin and then having texture in places you didn't want it, but also it has there's research done that the painting will be more archival over time and not crack as much with thinner layers first and then thicker layers on top. To be honest, I really don't think about the archival nature of the paintings too much with this and obsess over that. I will paint thickly and in the first initial block in if it is what I want the final painting to look like. I'm not tied to this. as a sort of handcuff to my creative process, but it is a helpful sort of acronym that's out there: fat over lean, fat paint over lean paint. And then thin darks and thick lights. Okay, so thinner darks, this plays into this whole physics element of how light waves work and interplay with paint. So light will travel through transparent paint, through thin paint, quicker than it will through thick opaque paint. It will literally hit the paint and then bounce back off rather than traveling right through. So if you want a dark area of the painting, say there's a really deep shadow, using that thinner paint that's transparent, that light waves will travel through better, will further that illusion that it's a deep shadow just from a literal physics standpoint, how light is hitting the painting. Also, depending on how light is hitting the painting, thin areas of paint won't cast a shadow, where thick paint will, right? There's all these different lighting situations that are happening, some great, some not, but when you have a painting lit and there's a lot of texture, there will be shadows cast by that texture regardless of how it's lit, from below, from above, from the side, from multiple. You could have two shadows if you have two light sources on the painting. And having shadows being cast on the painting by thick paint in the shadows of your painting can diminish the lifelikeness and the illusion that that is a deep shadow if there's a shadow being cast on a shadow. So that's where that idea of having thin darks is superior just from a visual standpoint to further the illusion versus those thick lights, how the light waves won't bounce through it, they will bounce off of it rather, and then they'll cast a shadow. It furthers that illusion that those thick areas in the light are coming forward and they actually are truly being lit, and the thick paint looks like light hitting that subject. So there's all of these very technical reasons for using transparent paint versus opaque paint. Again, I don't want anyone to get too hung up on that and be sitting at the easel. Is this a fully transparent mixture that I'm putting into the shadows? Has any white gotten into the shadow? That's not my goal. Some artists do go that in depth and granular with it because they enjoy it and it fits with their personality. That doesn't fit with mine. I am excited to have the knowledge, to understand it, to use to my benefit, a tool in my toolbox. And I then love to see when artists and love to see when I can flip the script. You know, for example, there was many years ago, I had just learned of this idea of fat over lean. And I was in Scottsdale at a workshop, and I went into Legacy Gallery, and there was a large Daniel Keyes still life. And I was, studying this painting from far, from close. And I came up close and I realized that in the deepest darks, he had really thick paint that looked like it was applied with a palette knife, and it worked beautifully. And then I talked to him about it because I was actually in a workshop that he was teaching, palette project. This would have been in 2018 or so. And he said, yes, they say never to do deep, dark shadows, but I love to do it to create this visual interest of having some shadows be very, very thin, but then some shadows really richly thick and have it work, because all of those things are guidelines more than rules. So I have another aspect to how I use transparent and opaque paint. Do you think it's a good time to jump in? Do we need a palette cleanser question from you? Or am I talking for too long?
No, I think you should round it out.
Okay.
You're on a roll.
Okay, so I'll use transparent paint and opaque paint differently. You can look at your tubes of paint and figure out if the paint is transparent, semi-transparent, or opaque. There'll be a little square on the painting somewhere. If it is a white filled in square, it's opaque paint. That means there is white mixed into the paint. So examples of this would be King's Blue. It is an opaque paint. There is a lot of white mixed in. Or titanium white or other whites, they will have a white square on the tube. A semi-transparent paint will have a white square, just an outline of a square with a line through it. That means it's semi-opaque, semi-transparent. Then the fully transparent paints like transparent oxide red. I do believe that burnt umber the umbers are transparent as well. I can't be quoted on that. We could go find out by just looking at the tubes. They will just have a white square not filled in. that means they are transparent. How I will use these will be just being aware of the pigments on my palette. So for example, Raw Sienna by Rembrandt is a color I've had on my palette for years, and I replaced yellow ochre with Raw Sienna because it did the same thing, but it actually worked and carried a heavier load for me than yellow ochre. Yellow ochre is an opaque paint, so it has white mixed into it. So when I would have a deep dark shadow mixture that I needed to take warmer but not redder, and I didn't want to add transparent oxide red to the mixture, but it needed to go yellower, and I added yellow ochre, it lightened the value of that dark mixture when I didn't want it to. Versus Raw Sienna, which again, it's either semi-transparent or fully transparent. I can't 100% remember. But when I use Raw Sienna, it's a same very warm yellow, but it is far, far, far more transparent. It's darker in value. So when I add white to it, it basically becomes yellow ochre. But if I want to take a dark mixture and warm it up, it has a wider range for me. It warms that mixture, it turns it a little bit more yellow like I want, and it doesn't introduce white, and it doesn't lighten the value of the mixture. So that is how I will personally currently use transparent versus opaque paint. Raw Sienna did the same things as yellow ochre, but it did more. So yellow ochre got ousted and Raw Sienna took its place because it is a more versatile color. Same with amethyst versus I used to use cobalt violet, or I can't remember exactly the color. It was a Winsor & Newton color. Had a lot of white mixed into it. It was not as powerful. When I would add it to deep mixtures, it would just the chroma just died. And I've now replaced that with Amethyst by Michael Harding. It's a more transparent color. I can add white to it and get it very colorful up in the higher values, but then I can also use it in the deeper values to turn those deeper mixtures more purple.
A key takeaway that I'm getting from this is you really should get in the weeds on the technical side of your paints that you're using on your palette. You should know the transparency, you should be able to understand the opacity, and you have to be aware and study this. All this knowledge that you have of how these different types of paints from different brands are functioning on your palette, they did not come day one. You've really immersed yourself into the technical side of painting and how paints function. So for the audience, for all you listeners, we all know you're at different parts of your artistic journey. But as you can see, this has worked out very well for Stephanie, is to know your paints through and through. If it's on your palette, you should likely have a strong understanding of how this paint functions as well. And go ahead.
We talk about this a lot and more in depth in the Academy series, Color Coded. So inside Patreon, we have a tier of the Academy where we deep dive into principles of painting. So right now, as of February 2026, we have a full series on value, 5-part series, and then a full series on color called Color Coded. And in Color Coded, I share a lot about this, how you look at your palette as a tool. What can these colors do for me? What are they capable of? It's really so exciting when you think about painting in this way with this much curiosity and going in with a question of what if. There really will be very little time for you to be unenthused about painting because there's always something more to learn, and it doesn't even matter necessarily at that point what you're painting because you're just so in love with the act of painting and the curiosity of discovering what your paint can do that you didn't know yesterday.
As we round out this episode, we are introducing a new segment that we think will be very helpful to artists all around the world listening in, and that's going to be a working title is right now Stephanie's Wisdom. So Stephanie, help us out here. What is one challenge that you are coming up against in the studio? How are you working to overcome it? And then how do you translate that to guidance or a wisdom for the artists listening in today?
Wow, hon, you really sprung this on me. Okay. Currently, what I a challenge that I'm running up against in the studio is this tendency to want to overwork paintings. And you mentioned it earlier, but this video that we made alongside CW Mundy in 2025, uncovering the methods of the masters, really was the catalyst for me learning a lesson that I have been trying to learn for many, many, many years and have been receiving advice about, which is you say it better than I do. The phrase, the power of suggestion is far more...
Yeah, the power of suggestion is greater than the statement of reality.
For some reason, I can never get that correct and say it properly, but I've been hearing that. I've been seeing it in examples from many different artists, even beyond CW Mundy. That's CW Mundy's phrase, but in other ways, seeing that and hearing that from other artists, but it has just never quite sunk in. And I've always pushed, to a little bit more level of finish. To some people, they would say that's ridiculous, depending on other people's styles, they would say that I'm very loose, and I do err on the side of more looseness, but I really am learning that, and now realizing in my studio practice ways that I can become more artistic, suggest more powerfully. And so that's a current sort of thing that I'm wrestling with in the studio, is knowing when to stop and really getting to the essence, saying only what my painting needs, not saying everything that my reference tells me.
That's it for today's episode. If you are benefiting from this podcast, do us a favor, leave a comment below, tell us what you loved about the episode, or ask a question that we can include in a future episode. Lastly, go ahead and comment, and share this podcast with your artist friends or folks who really just want to learn more about representational art in general. Stephanie, you are a treasure trove of information, incredible stuff from you today. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks, honey. This was fun.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks for tuning in to today's episode of the Confident Brushstrokes podcast. If you found value in this conversation, hit subscribe so you don't miss future episodes, and consider leaving a rating or review. It helps other artists discover the show. Want to connect with Stephanie? Follow her on Instagram and YouTube at Stephanie Page Thompson. If you're looking for deeper dives, tutorials, or community support, check out her Patreon, where she shares exclusive content for artists at every level. Until next time, keep painting with confidence.